There are songs we sing with passion, songs that move our emotions, songs that make us feel close to God. But what if some of these very songs are quietly shaping your beliefs in ways that are not biblical? What if the melody is sweet, but the message is dangerous? Today we will uncover a truth many churches avoid speaking about, not to create fear, but to awaken discernment. Because worship is not entertainment. Worship is alignment with truth, and when truth is compromised, even beautiful music can lead the soul astray. Let us begin by understanding something very subtle, yet very powerful. Many people today measure the depth of their worship by the intensity of their emotions. They say, "I felt something," and therefore they assume it must have been spiritual. They say, "I cried during the song," and they believe this must mean they encountered truth. But emotions, my friends, are not always reliable guides. They are real, they are human, they are meaningful, but they are not always aligned with what is biblical. Music has a unique ability to move the heart. A certain chord progression can create longing. A rising melody can create hope. A powerful chorus repeated again and again can make the entire room feel united in passion. Lights dim, voices swell, hands rise, and suddenly there is an atmosphere that feels sacred. Yet we must pause and ask a courageous question. Is this truly spiritual transformation, or is it emotional stimulation? This is not an attack on music. Music is a beautiful gift. Throughout history, it has been used to express devotion, gratitude, lament, and reverence. But precisely because music is powerful, it must be handled with awareness. The danger begins when believers stop examining what they are singing and start surrendering only to how they are feeling. When the melody becomes the authority instead of truth, confusion slowly enters the heart. You see, the human mind can be persuaded by repetition. If a line is sung enough times, it begins to sound true. If a crowd sings it together, it begins to feel true. And if it feels true long enough, it may eventually be accepted as truth, even if it is not grounded in Scripture. This is how emotional experiences can quietly shape belief systems without people realizing it. They do not reject truth intentionally. They simply replace it unintentionally. There is also another subtle shift that happens. When worship becomes centered on emotional highs, believers start chasing moments instead of cultivating maturity. They begin to think that if they do not feel something intense, then God must not be present. This creates a fragile spirituality that depends on atmosphere rather than alignment. But real faith is not built only on moments of excitement. Real faith is built in stillness, in discipline, in understanding, and in quiet obedience. Consider how often we evaluate a song by saying, "This song is powerful." But powerful in what way? Powerful because it reveals truth, or powerful because it creates sensation? There is a difference. Sensation fades, truth remains. Sensation needs to be repeated again and again. Truth becomes a foundation that carries you even when the music stops, even when the room is silent, even when life becomes difficult. The mature believer learns to appreciate beauty without being controlled by it, to feel deeply without being deceived, to worship sincerely without abandoning discernment. Emotional expression is not wrong, but emotional dependence can be dangerous. When we learn to separate what we feel from what is true, our worship becomes calmer, deeper, and more rooted. Because in the end, it is not the intensity of your feelings that determines spiritual growth. It is the accuracy of your alignment with truth. There is something many people underestimate when they walk into a place of worship. They believe the sermon is the primary moment of teaching, the central place where beliefs are formed and understanding is shaped. And while sermons are important, there is another teacher present, quieter, more melodic, and often far more influential. That teacher is the song. Because what we sing repeatedly does not only pass through our ears, it settles into our memory, our imagination, and eventually into our theology. Think about how easily you can remember a song you learned years ago. You may forget the details of a message you heard last week, but a melody learned in childhood can stay with you for life. This is the mysterious power of rhythm and repetition. When words are wrapped in music, they travel deeper. They bypass intellectual resistance and enter emotional acceptance. They become familiar, and what is familiar begins to feel trustworthy. This is why songs must be approached with awareness, not just enthusiasm. When believers sing lyrics week after week, those lyrics slowly shape how they understand God, suffering, blessing, prayer, and faith itself. A single phrase, repeated often enough, can build an entire belief system without formal teaching ever taking place. If a song subtly presents God as someone who exists mainly to fulfill human desires, that idea can begin to feel normal. If a song minimizes repentance, sacrifice, or perseverance, believers may start to view these realities as less important, not because they consciously reject truth, but because they have been emotionally trained to expect something else. This process is usually very gentle. It does not feel like indoctrination. It feels like inspiration. People leave feeling uplifted, encouraged, motivated, and these are not negative experiences. Yet inspiration without examination can become misdirection. The heart becomes full while the foundation becomes weak. Over time, faith becomes built more on poetic statements than on scriptural understanding. And when life presents challenges that do not match the promises embedded in those songs, confusion arises. Another important aspect to notice is how collective singing reinforces belief. When an entire congregation declares the same words together, it creates a sense of unity and certainty. Doubt becomes uncomfortable. Questioning feels unnecessary. The message feels validated simply because many voices agree. But truth is not determined by volume. Truth is determined by alignment. 1,000 people can sing something passionately, and it can still lack depth or accuracy. Mature spirituality requires the courage to listen carefully, not with suspicion, but with discernment. To ask quietly within oneself, what am I actually declaring right now? What view of God am I reinforcing in my own mind? What expectations am I forming about my own life and faith? These questions are not meant to disrupt worship, they are meant to purify it. Because when lyrics are rooted in truth, singing becomes more than emotional expression. It becomes spiritual formation. There is a very quiet shift that has been happening in many spaces of worship, and it is so subtle that most people do not notice it at first. The language still sounds spiritual. The music still sounds uplifting. The atmosphere still feels sacred. Yet slowly, almost invisibly, the center of attention begins to move. Worship that was once focused on the greatness of God begins to revolve around the desires of the individual. The songs still mention faith, still mention victory, still mention blessing. But the direction has changed. Instead of lifting the heart upward in surrender, they begin to turn the heart inward in expectation. This is how self-centered worship emerges. Not through rebellion, not through intentional distortion, but through gradual emphasis. When lyrics repeatedly highlight personal breakthrough, personal elevation, personal recognition, and personal emotional fulfillment, the act of worship can become transactional. It becomes less about reverence and more about results, less about devotion and more about outcomes. The believer may begin to think, even subconsciously, that singing is a way to activate something, to secure something, to move circumstances in a desired direction. But true worship has never been about control. It has always been about surrender. It is the quiet acknowledgement that life is not centered around human preference, but around divine purpose. When songs continuously reinforce the idea that faith guarantees immediate victory or that spiritual expression must always produce visible success, they create expectations that reality cannot always sustain. Life includes seasons of waiting, seasons of confusion, seasons of silence. A faith that has only been trained to celebrate achievement may struggle to remain steady in the presence of uncertainty. There is also a deeper psychological dynamic at work. The more we sing about ourselves, the more we become aware of ourselves. The more attention is directed toward personal feelings, personal dreams, personal breakthroughs, the harder it becomes to experience humility. Worship then risks becoming a mirror rather than a window, reflecting our own desires back to us instead of opening our vision towards something greater. And when the self becomes the silent center, even spiritual language can unintentionally feed ego rather than soften it. This does not mean that personal struggles or hopes should be excluded from worship. Human experience is part of spiritual life. Longing, pain, gratitude, and aspiration are all real, yet the orientation matters. Are these experiences being offered upward in trust, or are they being projected outward as demands? Are songs helping believers release control, or are they encouraging them to tighten their grip on outcomes? These are important questions because the posture of the heart is shaped by what it repeatedly declares. Mature worship gently dissolves the illusion that everything revolves around personal comfort or personal success. It creates space for awe, for reverence, for stillness. It reminds the believer that faith is not a performance and not a negotiation. It is a relationship grounded in trust, even when circumstances do not align with expectation. When songs restore this perspective, they bring balance. They transform excitement into devotion and ambition into humility. Another subtle influence that has found its way into certain worship environments is the language of manifestation, often disguised in spiritual vocabulary. On the surface, the words sound confident, hopeful, and faith-filled. They speak about declaring victory, speaking realities into existence, and repeating promises until they become visible. Many people resonate with this because it feels empowering. It creates the impression that through enough intensity, enough repetition, and enough conviction, one can shape outcomes and direct the course of life. Yet this idea requires careful reflection. Faith, in its deepest sense, has never been about controlling reality. It has been about trusting a reality that is guided by wisdom beyond human understanding. When songs begin to suggest that singing certain lines or making certain declarations guarantees specific results, they risk turning devotion into technique. Worship then becomes less about communion and more about activation, less about relationship and more about strategy. The believer may start to feel that spiritual growth is measured by how strongly they can assert their desires rather than how deeply they can surrender their will. There is a psychological comfort in believing that words alone can command circumstances. It reduces uncertainty. It gives a sense of participation in shaping destiny. But this comfort can become fragile when life unfolds in ways that do not match the repeated declarations, when healing does not come immediately, when doors remain closed, when struggles persist despite passionate singing, confusion begins to grow. Some may even feel that they have failed spiritually, that they did not believe strongly enough or declare loudly enough. In this way, a theology of manifestation can quietly produce guilt instead of peace. It is important to understand the difference between hope-filled expression and entitlement. Worship songs that encourage gratitude, perseverance, and trust strengthen the heart. They prepare the believer to walk through both light and shadow with steadiness. But songs that imply guaranteed outcomes can unintentionally disconnect faith from humility. They create the illusion that divine purpose must align with human preference. This is not faith. This is expectation wrapped in spiritual language. Another dimension of this issue is the way repetition influences identity. When believers constantly sing about possessing authority over every situation, they may slowly lose the ability to accept limitation. Yet limitation is a teacher. Waiting is a teacher. Silence is a teacher. These experiences refine character in ways that instant victory cannot. If worship removes these realities from the spiritual narrative, it produces a shallow resilience that struggles under real pressure. This does not mean that confident declarations are always wrong. Confidence can be an expression of trust. Speaking hope can strengthen the mind. But the foundation must remain grounded in alignment rather than control. True faith says, "I will sing with devotion, I will pray with sincerity, and I will act with courage. Yet I remain open to a wisdom greater than my own desires." When songs preserve this balance, they nurture maturity. When they distort it, they create tension between expectation and experience. There is another theme that has quietly gained prominence in many modern worship songs: the constant emphasis on visible blessing, material success, and outward favor. These songs often speak about elevation, increase, abundance, and breakthrough in ways that sound deeply encouraging. They paint a picture of faith that is always moving upward, always progressing towards something bigger, better, and more impressive. For many listeners, this message feels motivating. It creates excitement about the future. It fuels the belief that devotion will naturally lead to a life of continual expansion. Yet when this theme becomes dominant, it can also create expectations that are not always grounded in the full reality of spiritual life. Faith is not a guarantee of comfort. It is not a contract for uninterrupted success. Throughout history, some of the most sincere believers have walked through seasons of loss, uncertainty, rejection, and waiting. Their faith did not remove hardship. It gave them strength to endure it. When songs repeatedly present blessing as the primary evidence of divine presence, they may unintentionally suggest that struggle is a sign of spiritual deficiency. This can be deeply confusing for individuals who are doing their best to live with integrity, yet still face challenges beyond their control. The human mind is naturally drawn to messages of prosperity and visible reward. We are wired to seek progress, recognition, and security. Worship that constantly reinforces these desires can feel comforting in the moment. It creates a sense that everything will soon align, that obstacles are temporary interruptions on a guaranteed path towards success. But life does not always follow this script. There are times when prayers are met with silence, when effort does not immediately produce results, when faith must remain steady without external confirmation. In such moments, believers who have been formed primarily by songs of triumph may feel disoriented. This disorientation can lead to subtle inner questions. If blessing is always promised, why am I still struggling? If favor is meant to be visible, why does my situation remain unchanged? These questions are not signs of weak faith. They are signs of unmet expectations. When worship has focused more on outcomes than on character, more on arrival than on endurance, it leaves individuals unprepared for the depth of real spiritual growth. True maturity often develops not in seasons of abundance, but in seasons of limitation. There is also a risk that prosperity-centered language narrows the definition of blessing itself. It can make people overlook the quiet gifts that are not measurable, patience that grows through difficulty, compassion that deepens through shared pain, wisdom that emerges from reflection. These forms of blessing do not always feel dramatic, but they shape the soul in lasting ways. Songs that acknowledge struggle alongside hope create a balanced vision of faith. They remind believers that devotion is not only about receiving, it is also about becoming. When worship restores space for lament, surrender, and perseverance, it strengthens resilience. It teaches the heart to remain grateful even when circumstances are uncertain. It cultivates a faith that is not dependent on constant progress, but anchored in trust. Because when prosperity becomes the central promise, disappointment becomes inevitable. But when transformation becomes the focus, every season holds meaning. At this point, it is important to understand that developing discernment in worship is not an act of criticism, it is an act of responsibility. Many people hesitate to question the songs they sing because they fear being seen as negative, judgmental, or spiritually rigid. They assume that going along with everything is a sign of humility, and that raising thoughtful concerns is a sign of pride. But true humility does not mean silence in the face of confusion. It means having the courage to seek clarity while remaining respectful in heart and intention. Discernment is not about pointing fingers at artists, leaders, or congregations. It is not about creating division or proving intellectual superiority. It is about protecting the inner alignment of one's own faith. Every believer is entrusted with the responsibility to examine what they allow to shape their mind and spirit. Just as we are careful about what we eat because it affects the body, we must also be careful about what we repeatedly declare because it affects the soul. Worship is not only a collective experience, it is also a personal formation. There is a common misunderstanding that sincerity alone guarantees correctness. People say, but they are singing with passion, or the intention is good. While sincerity is valuable, it does not automatically ensure accuracy. A person can be deeply sincere and still be mistaken. This is why maturity involves testing inspiration with reflection. It involves asking gentle but necessary questions. Does this song draw me closer to truth, or does it simply excite me? Does it deepen my reverence, or does it strengthen my expectations? Does it encourage surrender, or does it reinforce control? Another dimension of discernment is the willingness to stand calmly apart when needed. There may be moments when everyone around you is fully engaged in a song that you feel uncertain about. In such moments, discernment is not expressed through dramatic reactions or visible disapproval. It is expressed through quiet awareness. You may choose to remain present without fully participating. You may choose to listen more carefully rather than sing automatically. This is not rebellion. It is attentiveness. It reflects a faith that is awake rather than passive. Discernment also requires balance. It is easy to swing toward extremes, either rejecting everything out of fear or accepting everything out of convenience. True wisdom walks a middle path. It appreciates beauty, creativity, and emotional expression while remaining grounded in deeper understanding. It recognizes that worship evolves with culture, yet it also remembers that foundational truths remain steady. When believers cultivate this balanced awareness, they become less reactive and more rooted. Over time, this practice transforms the way worship is experienced. Songs are no longer consumed unconsciously. They are received intentionally. Faith becomes less about momentary excitement and more about long-term formation. The heart learns to respond with depth rather than impulse, and in this quiet refinement, spiritual confidence begins to grow. Not the loud confidence of performance, but the calm confidence of alignment. Because discernment is not about judging what others sing. It is about safeguarding what you allow to shape your soul.